for a third time. Captain Aram had journeyed by wagon train to California in 1846, just after the Mexican-American War was heating up. He encountered General Fremont, who dispatched him to San Jose to secure the town for the Americans. Aram did the job with no loss of life, and when the fighting ended, he was one of the prominent citizens selected as a member of the California Convention, and because his name began with A, he became the first signer of the California Constitution. After a few years after living in Monterey, he was elected to the San Jose City Council and was also a member of the first Board of Trustees of the College of Pacific. Why is this so important in the story of the founding of Carmel? Well, after marrying Grace Devendorf Gray in 1876, Captain Aram became especially fond of his stepson, Frank. It is believed that he is the first person who introduced Frank to the Monterey Peninsula. Furthermore, he had a great passion for plants. He established the first nursery in California on the outskirts of San Jose, and he planted many non-native trees and bushes to beautify the city. A 1956 issue of the magazine Western North America refers to a tree planted by Jones of Aram as being, quote, the oldest known eucalyptus tree in Western North America, unquote. I mention this because it is certain that his stepfather's interest in protecting and enhancing the environment must have been a strong influence on Frank when he planted the trees down Ocean Avenue and made the rules about preserving the trees in Carmel. The earliest letter from Frank that my mother found was dated May 1877, written from Prescott, Arizona, and sent to the young lady with whom he had fallen in love, Lily Potter, my great-grandmother. He informs her that he is still not entirely well and is forcing himself to stay outdoors. His interest in real estate has already begun because he writes, quote, if I stay here, I will purchase a lot in some nice location for our home. Lily must not have been particularly delighted with the prospect of moving to Arizona. At the time, she was about to enroll in the music program at the newly founded College of the Pacific in Santa Clara. Lily subsequently entered the first class that accepted women. As an aside, the college later moved to Stockton, where its conservatory is still very distinguished. And much later, I also attended the University of the Pacific, and our family donated the organ in the chapel in honor of my great-grandmother. Getting back to the story, Frank was very much in love with Lily. A letter from 21-year-old Frank to 18-year-old Lily shows that their plans for the future, their future life, had already been made. Quote, my dear Lily, I have just finished the perusal of your previous letter. Words cannot express the joy that I experienced on the receipt of a letter from you. I do not expect anyone to be surprised at the feeling expressed above, for what else could be expected when all the love that my nature is capable of is centered on you. All my hopes for happiness in the future depend on you, and sometimes I think that my hopes of heaven depend on having my idol Lily, with her goodness and purity, for an example, to lead me to better and higher things. Frank and Lily did marry 2 years later in 1879. And from then on, the story of James Franklin Devendorf is also the story of the wife and daughters that he adored and that supported him emotionally in everything he did, even though his business life was largely spent apart from his family. If Frank was the creative spirit, the dreamer and adventurer in the family, Lily was its strength. We aren't sure where he worked all those early years, but in that era, a conscientious young man did not assume the responsibilities of a wife and family until he was able to provide the necessary support, and a loving father did not allow his daughter to marry unless he was assured that his future son-in-law were able to do so. So we have to assume that by age 23, he was gainfully employed. The earliest indication my mom found relating to his employment was an 1883 announcement at age 27 of the opening of a subdivision in San Martin and Morgan Hill, San Martin. A.L. Burbank and J.F. Devendorf are listed as agents. We also know he was listed as the agent of record in the sale of the expansive Catherine Dunn Ranch in 1893. Through an interesting twist of fate, we can get a picture of young Frank in action during those early years. In the 1880s and 90s, my grandfather, Edward Hofeld, was a poor boy growing up in San Francisco. The family had no money for vacations, and my grandfather related to my mom that one of the few pleasures he and his older brother had was to take advantage of the free promotions offered by real estate agents. The promotions included a free train ride back and forth from San Francisco and free lunch at the site of the property being offered for sale. My grandfather was probably in his teens when he remembered a particularly powerful presentation made by a real estate agent by the name of Devendorf, selling land in the Morgan Hill area. The next time my grandfather heard that name was in 1912, when on summer vacation from Harvard Law School, he paid a visit to a certain Frances Toll at her home in the Sierra foothills near Auburn, California. Mrs. Toll, the aunt of Lily Potter, was married to one of the Toll brothers who had become prosperous in the lumber industry. Summers were spent in their beautiful home in Toll near the present town of Dutch Flat, but during the winter they stayed in Auburn where there was less snow. And it was there that she had become acquainted with the young principal of the Auburn High School, Edward Hofeld, who was pursuing a teaching career until he had sufficient funds to attend law school. Imagine his surprise and eventually his delight when, upon arriving for his visit, he encountered a young Lillian Devendorf, who was spending some time with her great aunt. Obviously, the visit was an auspicious one, otherwise I would not be here talking to you today, but that's another story. Little wine. My grandmother, Lillian Devendorf, was actually the fourth of 5 daughters born to Frank and Lily Devendorf. Their first daughter, Grace, died at childbirth. The second was Edwina, an artist whose work you all know. A bust of her father is situated here in Carmel in Devendorf Park. Edwina was born deaf due to a case of measles that her mother had contracted while she was pregnant. The third daughter's name was Myrtle. Then came my grandmother Lillian, and finally Marion. My grandmother always said that by the time she was born in 1890, her father had become quite prosperous. In 1897, the family was able to move from downtown San Jose to a beautiful home in the hills above Alum Rock Park. By January 1900, on the way to one of his business enterprises in Los Angeles, Frank Devendorf wrote to his wife, quote, "Our affairs are getting in better shape all the time. I have worked hard for it, and I'm glad I did not give up and have nervous prostration. I will tell you what has done most for me was your love, confidence, and bravery, and a man must have that when he is in water up to his neck and still rising." His struggle had been enormous, and it was finally succeeding. And then came Carmel. How can one describe Frank Devendorf? A visionary, an impractical dreamer, a gambler? Well, not a gambler in the ordinary sense of the word, but he did gamble his family's present and future security when he got rid of all of his other assets and occupations and devoted himself entirely to the development of Carmel. Certainly, he was a visionary. My grandmother recalled a historic picnic on a point of land on the 17-mile drive. It was summer 1900. Her father looked over at the curving white sand of Carmel Beach and said, "Girls, I'm going to build a town there." By 1902, Frank Devendorf put all of his available assets into the Carmel project. Their beautiful home above Alum Rock Park, with its great verandas and spreading lawns, its household of servants and special tutors for his daughters, was sold. The family moved into a small rented house in Berkeley. It is not clear as to how James Devendorf first met Frank Powers, although tonight I was told, Aaron told me that they found some records that said they were probably neighbors. So I can't wait to see that information. But it's fairly clear that their initial encounter must have been somewhat prior to November 1900, for in that month, Powers purchased from Devendorf 2 lots that he had acquired in the Carmel area, and 702 lots from a certain Dr. Walton Saunders. Powers advanced all the money for the property that they planned to develop, and Devendorf, at no cost to Powers, agreed to give his entire time and attention to the management and sale of the properties. There must have been an incredible trust between these two men who, at the time of their initial agreement, had known each other for a very short while. Devendorf put his entire trust in Powers to abide by the contract that would eventually bring him financial rewards, and Powers entrusted the management of his large investment in land to a person he hardly knew. Frank Devendorf's prior record as a real estate agent must have impressed him, but even more, the man's enthusiasm, integrity, and willingness to take a risk. Both of them were great lovers of natural beauty. There is no doubt that both shared an aesthetic appreciation for this particular piece of property, and there is never any indication that Powers disagreed with Devendorf's vision of what the town should be. On the contrary, since they handled quite a bit of their business by mail, Powers often wrote to him, "These are my ideas on the subject, but you make the decision. I defer to your judgment on the matter." In the first board meeting held on November 28, 1902, for the Carmel Development Company, Devendorf proposed to take charge of the property, quote, "in the same manner as I have charge for Frank Powers, giving my entire time and attention toward the development of the property," unquote. For 2 years, for 25% of all sales of land made during this period. His proposal was unanimously adopted. My mother always stated that, quote, "for Frank Powers, Carmel by the Sea was part of the tapestry of his life. For Frank Devendorf, it was his masterpiece." Devendorf wanted to create a town for families. He wanted it to be a place where people could go to church, send their children to school, and enjoy the natural environment without the unnecessary encroachments of civilization. He wanted them to form a real community of friendship. That is why he insisted that there be no house numbers or street addresses. People would have to meet each other at least once a day when they went to the post office, he reasoned. He wanted the beach to be unspoiled, so he removed the bathhouse that had been part of a previous development. He loved trees and planted them everywhere, included a row of pines down the middle of Ocean Avenue. As you are likely aware, he established a law that no one was to cut down a tree, and if a tree were in the middle of a roadway, the roadway would have to go around it. He stated, I quote, "The settlement has been built on the theory that people of aesthetic taste would settle in a town of Carmel's naturally aesthetic beauties, provided all public enterprises were addressed towards preventing man and his civilized ways from unnecessarily marring the natural beauty so lavishly displayed here." His office was the place to which everyone who had a dispute would go for a resolution. He encouraged people from every background and every occupation to settle in Carmel. The only requirement was that they had to love the town. If they did, money was often no object. He was known to tell future impetuous buyers, "Well, if you can't afford the property, I'll loan you the down payment and put up the money myself to build you a house." Initially, lots in Carmel by the sea were slow to sell. A $500 cottage was easily secured with a $5 or $10 deposit, or $6 per month to rent. By 1905, there were 75 residents, several stores, a restaurant, a school, and hotel. After the 1906 earthquake, however, lots sold more vigorously as displaced San Franciscans looked for new places to live. And by 1913, there were approximately 550 permanent residents and thousands of summer visitors, and by 1940, this number grew to over 2,800 residents.